Hi, good afternoon. I'm Tracy Mann with South by Southwest Eco. I'm the community engagement lead and I work on the programming team. I'm very pleased to see that you're here for a speaker that means a lot to me that was able to be here with us today, Nikki Silvestri from Green for All. And I presume that you're here because you know something about Green for All. You know that Van Jones started Green for All in 2007 to build a green economy strong enough to lift people out of poverty. And Nikki is the third of the executive directors Green for All has had, and it's really, really courageous work and its scope. And I had, in preparing to introduce her, I had found an article that she'd written on, that appeared on Huffington Post earlier this year. Something really struck me. She wrote that when we talk about climate change at Green for All, it's not just about cutting greenhouse gases and creating emergency response plans for the storms and severe weather we're seeing more and more of. It's about cultivating economic benefits, economic health, and supporting strong social fabric in the neighborhoods that are hit hardest. And I think that's what we heard Dr. Bullard speak so eloquently about this morning in the welcome talk. Nikki is the I'm sorry, I'm getting a message here, a little message. Nikki was formerly with People's Grocery in Oakland, and where she worked on environmental justice and food. And Nikki shares with South by Southwest a love of music and a sense that music is integral to building social movements. So I'm very happy to introduce Nikki Silvestri.
All right, it's the end of the day. People are falling asleep. Oh, I actually promised that I would use this mic. Okay. Not on yet. And now it's on. Okay, rewind. Is everybody awake? Ish. That was a very enthusiastic woohoo, but we're going to do the stretching exercise anyway. Raise your hands over your head. Wiggle your fingers. Live stream folk, where are you? Where's the camera? It's over here, right? Live stream folk, raise your hand. Wiggle your fingers. Lean over this way. Lean over that way. Keep wiggling. Drop down and give yourself a little neck massage. Both sides. Taking a deep breath in and let it out. Another deep breath in and let it out. One thing that's great about speaking at environmental conferences is that we're animals in a habitat. And in places that really value the environment, that doesn't sound strange to say that. And I also have a theater background, so I know how hard it is to sit for long periods of time. So if you need to move, get up, wiggle around, shift positions, I will not be offended. So music, soul, and movement building, and the environment. What do all of those things have to do with one another? I went to the Environmental Protection Agency's carbon emission standards rulings that happened in late July. Does everybody know what that is, the carbon emission standards ruling? So for those of you who don't, the Environmental Protection Agency regulates several different things that coal plants emit. Arsenic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The one thing it doesn't regulate is the thing that actually causes the greenhouse gas effect, carbon. So this year it decided that it was going to try to do carbon emission standards so that coal power plants would actually have to regulate or pay. Right? With me so far? So there was a period of public comment in late July where we all got together. We were supposed to show up and say, yeah, we're for the rule, or no, we're not for the rule. I went to the one in DC and to the one in Pittsburgh. Both days that I presented, I was the only person of color. And it was a stark contrast for me, because at least at the hearing in DC, there was a rally. And so many faces at the rally were people of color. But very few faces of color were actually in the hearings, testifying, participating in the democratic process, right? So we can sing, we can dance, we can go rah, rah, rah and inspire, but we can't actually impact change. This was very disheartening for me. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why this intersection of inspiration and implementation is so important to me. Because you absolutely have to have inspiration. You have to have vision. You have to have music. You have to have spirit. You have to have soul. And that can't be divorced from the concrete solutions. You can't segregate them and put them in two different camps and say that they don't talk to each other and they won't meet. Because if I'm going to be inviting a single black mother to participate in making sure that the EPA can regulate carbon, she's got to be able to go to something that's accessible to her, but that's also impactful. And a rally is really accessible, but it may not actually affect the rule. And if the hearing is boring as shit and isn't something that you're going to want to take a day off work for and isn't something that's going to be accessible or understandable, then how are you going to participate? So that story kind of demonstrates the conundrum that I'm in. And I'm hoping that over the course of this talk, I can give some examples, offer some stories, and then I'm really looking forward to seeing what questions you have afterward. So, this divide is real. I wanted to start with a personal story as well, just to kind of tell you a little bit about where I come from and why this split between inspiration and implementation, I think, hit me in my heart, especially when it comes to environmentalism. So I'm an 80s baby. I grew up in the land of Captain Planet. Y'all know Captain Planet? Oh, raise your hand if you know who Captain Planet is. Guys, okay, anyone who doesn't know who Captain Planet is, you need to go YouTube him immediately. It was a cartoon, late 80s, early 90s. He had blue skin, green hair. There were a bunch of kids, a white kid, Asian kid, black kid, Indian kid. They would go fight environmental destruction. And the voice of the earth was Whoopi Goldberg, because that should be the voice of the earth. And whenever they couldn't fight polluters by themselves, they would band together and form Captain Planet, who was their powers combined, and then he would go fight the polluters, right? Now, I'm 7 years old watching this show, and this is what I think environmentalism looks like. A white kid, a black kid, an Asian kid, an Indian kid, all getting together to fight environmental pollution. So I go to school and I talk about wanting to be an environmentalist. And what I got back from my peers more than anybody was, but black people have issues much more serious to think about than environmentalism and tree hugging. And what I got back from my teachers was, why don't you do some research into environmentalism? And now, for anybody who is younger than the 80s generation, we had these things in libraries called card catalogs before there was the internet. So I went to the card catalog and I looked up the newsletters from the big environmental organizations, NWF, EDF, NRDC, and was confronted with page after page after page after page of white dude. And it really sunk in that I didn't think environmentalism was made for me. This was not my issue. I could get riled up and do really concrete issues with my people, like police brutality. And in the early 90s, I grew up in Los Angeles. The issues with African American people in the early 90s were real, right? My parents did everything they could to make sure that my brothers survived the early 90s. And I have 7 older foster brothers. Several of them didn't make it through the early 90s in Los Angeles. These were really hard times. So people are saying to me, you have to choose. They were saying this because this was a reality that we were living, and we couldn't figure out how to not do that, how to not put a line in the sand and choose. Then I went to college, and because my mother is something of an eco-spiritualist hippie type, I was raised eating healthy food, not wasting. A lot of the environmental values were really close to my heart, so I couldn't put it down. I ended up getting into sustainability, especially after An Inconvenient Truth came out. And so I would join the sustainability students in all the environmental activities and be the only black person statewide doing anything, right? And then I would go to the African Student Union and fight for my people. And every once in a while, I would get the different groups confused. I would go to the African Student Union and forget to flush the toilet. I would listen to really offensive hip hop with the Sustainability Coalition. And I just got schizophrenic and crazy and sad, right? Because I had friends everywhere, but nowhere did I feel wholly expressed. There's so many people who go through that struggle, who still feel that line in the sand. Luckily, I managed to escape it because of a guy named Van Jones. I saw him speak in 2007 when I was a graduate student. And when he said, this is the speech that Al Gore would have given had he been black, I was sold. Sold. I promptly moved up to the Bay Area to hunt him down and do whatever I could to work for him. I ended up being able to work for him, and the last 6 years have been wonderful. Green for All is the organization I now run, and it was an organization I started at as an aide 6 years ago. I was the executive director of People's Grocery, which is a wonderful organization in Oakland that works on economic development and public health issues related to the food system. And I've been able to see all of these people of color, bless you. I've been able to see all of these people of color really take on environmentalism as their own. It's been beautiful, and it's been trying. Because the problem, when it comes to how bad is it, right? When I talk about environmentalism and people of color, why am I really harping on that? Now, we all know a lot of the usual statistics, right? We African Americans have a 25 to 50% higher chance of getting asthma in this country. Almost 70% of African Americans live near a coal power plant. Things like that. But one thing that I wanted to talk about today, because it's on my mind and it's on my heart, is water. So recently, last month, in the month of September, there were 28 communities that were on the drought list for being at risk of running out of water in 60 days. Now, who are these 28 communities? They're poor, they're rural, and they're primarily Latino, right? So when I talk about the impacts of environmental degradation and environmental injustice, California, what percentage do you think? Now, everybody, when they talk about the California drought, it's we need to start saving more water. We need to start conserving our water use, right? That's the thing that's been spreading, at least around the Bay Area where I live. What percentage of California's water use is personal individual, do you think? Just throw out some numbers. Say what? Less than 20, we got one. Anybody else? What was that? 10%. Anybody else? 5%. Anybody else? 4%. 4% of California's water use is personal individual. Guess how much is agricultural? 80%. 80%. So we're all sitting here in the California drought talking about how we need to conserve water, and it is a drop in the bucket. But when I say something like agriculture uses 80%, and then I talk about 28 rural, primarily Latino, farm-working communities that are running out of water, the water is going to the cows, the water is going to the plants, and the water is not going to the people that feed us, right? And farm workers, in terms of what they interact with on a day-to-day basis, the risk of miscarriages because of pesticide use, dehydration and heat stroke, because they don't get water breaks anyway. How many jobs are going to be lost in farm working because of the California drought? Anybody? Over 17,000 this year. $2.2 billion worth of losses in the state of California because of the drought. How does this translate into people? Farm workers, on average, make a little over $19,000 a year in California, and that's in a good year. That's in a good year. With that kind of job loss, those kind of environmental impacts on their health already, it's sickening and it's horrifying. And this is everyday reality for everyone in America who eats food. This is where it comes from. Now, obviously, this is an issue near and dear to my heart because I worked in food system for so long. But when we talk about climate change, water is going to be one of the first ways that it hits us, right? And it's going to hit our communities the hardest. People of color, low-income communities, and rural communities. So, what do we do about this? Right? What do we do about this? There's breakdown and there's breakthrough. Many of us in this country are privileged. That means that we spend the majority of our time living in the breakthrough. We don't worry about where our next meal is going to come from. We're not food insecure, right? We watch a lot of TV. We have our smartphones with our social media. We can afford to come to a conference. Things like that. I am one of these people. I don't experience breakdown as a norm in my life. the majority of my family does experience breakdown as a norm in their lives. Cousins, aunties, uncles, nieces, nephews. And I found that when you're in breakthrough, hearing a little bit of the breakdown can actually spur one to action. Because if you're in too much of the breakthrough, it's hard sometimes to ground oneself in what needs to be done. Or just the urgency isn't there, right? The urgency isn't there. But if you're in breakdown the majority of the time, sometimes what you need is a little breakthrough. My husband, Galen, he runs a community center in Oakland called United Roots. And part of how he started his work was that he ran a record company called Cov Records out of a homeless shelter, Covenant House homeless shelter in Oakland. And he worked with youth that were on the edge, right? It's a homeless shelter. You're on the edge. And this record company was such a shining light in so many of those kids' lives. And he's followed many of them 10 to 15 years throughout their whole careers. And I'm telling you, it's hard. Things are really hard. That community center, the music, sitting down and having a conversation with him, sometimes that's the light that keeps people together. So if you're in breakdown, having a little bit of the light can help. And if you're always in the light, seeing a little bit of the darkness can help. And for me, that is the mix when it comes to movement building. It's mixing the light and the dark. It's mixing the problem with the solution. It's making sure that everyone has what they need to actually activate. And my question at the beginning of this was, how do you bring those two things together? What does it look like when you really mix those, mix them well, and are able to really do something positive? It's one of the reasons why I was attracted to Green for All in the first place, and one of the reasons why I'm really honored to work there now. Because I feel like the work Green for All has done has been this mix, or at least it's tried to. So I wanted to share a few things that we've been up to this year, and then hopefully lead into some questions, because that's actually how I like to spend the majority of my time, is interacting with people. So this year, Green for All, I talked about the Environmental Protection Agency carbon emission standards, right? Now, the issue with the carbon emission standards is that a lot of people are going to be trying to make sure these things don't exist. Because if you regulate carbon emissions, you lose money. But the only people that are losing money are the 0.01%, right? We don't want anyone to lose, because we're about everyone. However, we do want wealth redistribution. So, Green for All wanted to work to make sure that we were protecting the EPA's ability to protect us. And a question that came up was, do people of color actually care about the environment? Do we care? And that's not a stupid question if you think about my earlier story and what I heard when I was a kid, right? There is this assumption that folks just have the day-to-day survival mode stuff to deal with, and tree hugging, whale saving ain't our shit, right? It actually couldn't be more wrong. Green for All did a national poll earlier this year because we wanted the facts. There have been other polls done about people of color and our opinion on climate change and the environment, but we wanted one that was current. We wanted one that mixed African Americans, Latinos, and Asians, and we wanted one that actually had questions about the carbon emission standards directly. So we surveyed 400 likely voters of African American descent, 400 likely voters of Latino descent, 100 likely voters of Asian descent in battleground states. And we released the poll results in late July. What did we find? 75% of people of color in this country regularly seek news about climate change. Not just find it randomly, regularly seek it. 75% of people of color in this country think that carbon emission standards are going to create jobs, not kill jobs. But in an interesting turn, 50% of people of color in this country think that carbon emission standards will, in the short term, lose jobs. So that was one thing that we found that was interesting. We actually have a complex understanding of these things. Sometimes you need to do costs in the short term for gains in the long term. We also tried to rank issues in terms of what we care about the most. Is it water? Is it transportation? Is it food? Is it energy? Not surprisingly, rising gas prices was top of the list. Underneath that was rising energy costs. Underneath that was health. So energy is really top of mind for people of color in this country when it comes to the environment. 70%, this is a good one, 70% of people of color would vote differently on a candidate if that candidate had a bad position on climate change. Now, if you're in a battleground state and you see a poll like this, potentially, hopefully, this might encourage one as a politician to go the right way on this because you see that voters are actually going to change their minds. The last thing that I'll say about the poll is that when asked about what's the reason to care about the environment, what's the top reason in your mind to care about climate change? It was the fact that we have a moral obligation to leave our children a better planet. That was at the top of the list. And that's one thing that I think is my favorite thing about that poll, is that it showed that we actually get it. We are animals in a habitat, and we have a responsibility to play nice and not be buttheads. We have a responsibility to make sure that our grandkids can breathe and actually have access to a planet. That's what we care about. We sent that poll far and wide, and we wanted to make sure that we could support the EPA. Now, another thing that we just did is we released a report on climate resiliency. So when I talk about climate resiliency, what am I talking about? Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, right? Now, when you look at what community of people is most devastated by those things, it's obviously people of color and low-income people. We've all seen the videos. We all know a lot of the statistics. The question is what to do about it. So earlier this year, the president convened a disaster preparedness task force on climate resiliency with 26 mayors from across the country who were supposed to submit reports to the White House that are going to get compiled into one report that's going to go to the president later this year. And then the president is going to pick climate resiliency recommendations for all of the departments to use in their planning. This was pretty significant. Now, what was also interesting, there were two things that were interesting about this task force. Of the 26 mayors, 2 were people of color. 2 were people of color. And New Orleans and New York were not represented because those mayors were busy dealing with the actual effects of climate change. So one of the things that Green for All wanted to do, along with many other organizations, was make sure that the recommendations from those who really needed to get them to the Center for Environmental Quality got them there. So we did roundtables in New York, we did roundtables in New Orleans, and we did roundtables in a couple of other cities to gather real-time information from people on what climate resiliency means to you. If you live in a low-income community and you've seen heat wave after heat wave after heat wave after wildfire after flood, what would you do? What do you know needs to be done? And there were a few interesting things that we found, all of which we submitted in the report. And there's one thing that I want to focus on. Now, when Hurricane Sandy hit, and whenever there's a flood, there's always refugees, right? Refugees in your own city. Usually what happens is that you get a voucher and you get sent to some motel in BFE somewhere super far away, right? You don't know your grocery, you don't have access to anything you usually use. Your laundromat, your grocery store, you're around people you don't know. It's destabilizing and it sucks, but it's what we have, right? So what happened in Sandy? Something really interesting happened when it came to housing in Hurricane Sandy. Airbnb. Airbnb hosts started listing their homes for $0 specifically to take in refugees who were down the street. Airbnb people saw this happening and were like, whoa, okay, this is great. Let's see if we can make this better. And stayed up all night and cranked out a whole new platform within Airbnb that activates in times of climate disaster, right? This was so effective that it is now like the #1 used disaster housing thing that happens all over the world because they've got hosts all over the world, right? The government is starting to talk to them because they're more efficient, because, it's a peer-to-peer network and it actually works very quickly. We included that in our report because we want to show that things like the collaborative economy and peer-to-peer networks can actually be used to make sure that climate resiliency works for all. People usually have things and people need things. And it's usually the platforms to allow people who need things to get them from people who have things that are what don't work. But now we live in the age of technology, and now we have something called the collaborative economy and the sharing economy that has shown us how to really trick out peer-to-peer networks on tech platforms that integrate into your phone, right? That integrate into whatever type of technology you have. So that was something that we really wanted to lift up, and we hope will be replicated in the future with things like transportation and food and waste and water, etc., during times of disaster. So that's the more technical, concrete side of the house, right? On the inspirational side of the house, one thing that we know is that if we're talking about movement building, inspiration is the very foundation of it. So we did a summer tour. We didn't want to be talking at people about carbon emission standards because, frankly, they're boring. The carbon emissions, the carbon rule, 645 pages. I am proud to say I got through half of it. It was surprisingly accessible and double-spaced, so really it's only like 300 pages, but still, right? I'm not going to give that to anybody. Even the 2-pager is a little too much. So Green for All did what Green for All does. We did a tour. We did a music tour. And then we threw in things about the carbon emission standards and climate resiliency. And it worked. In Denver, we worked with one of this great fellow, DJ Cavum, and it was the Juneteenth festival in Denver. And let me tell you something. Okay, Juneteenth. So when emancipation from slavery happened, there were many communities that did not know they were free. And Juneteenth, June 19th, was the last community in America found out that they were actually free. And it was, like a year after we were actually free, which sucks. But it was in Texas. Yeah, there you go. So a lot of black people, like me, still celebrate Juneteenth because it's a celebration of freedom, right? But more importantly, it's the celebration of the distinction between concrete freedom and psychological freedom. And it's a celebration of the fact that we need to know what is happening with our people so that we don't miss really important announcements, like the fact that we're no longer slaves. So we did Juneteenth. We do Juneteenth celebrations all over the country. Green for All partnered with the city of Denver to put on the Juneteenth Festival in Denver, Colorado this year. And Juneteenth, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful festival, and we had a whole stage devoted to Keep It Fresh. We did Keep It Fresh awards for eco-heroes and eco-warriors in the Denver community that were people of color, that were everyday folks, that were doing really positive things around climate change and the environment for their people. I did a rile 'em up, get 'em down speech, and it really fired people up. And even though it was only 5 minutes worth of content, it's 5 minutes that mattered. Because people only take away a small percentage of the things you say anyway, especially if you're giving a wonky talk. But people got my 5 minutes, they signed comment cards that went directly to the EPA, and they got information. And then Les Nubian performed and really locked it in. And for those of you who don't know Les Nubian, they are of African descent. They are from Paris, and they sing in French, and they're wonderful. So you should look them up. But one of the takeaways from our summer tour was that you can't actually replace inspiration or implementation. You got to have both attached at the same time. In every city, we did the summer tour in 4 cities, and in every city that we went to, we had a roundtable to talk concretely about climate resiliency. We had prayer breakfasts in a couple of those cities to launch our new Green the Church campaign that Green for All is doing this fall. We had music, we had celebration, we had food. We tried to layer as much as we could in that summer tour to make sure that it was a holistic way of engaging people. And for me, that's really the core and the spirit of movement building. One of the last things that I want to talk about is the People's Climate March. So now take Green for All's tour and multiply that by 1 million. And that was the People's Climate March. Did anybody go? Anybody in this room, were you there in New York? Okay, great. There were a couple people that were there. So for anyone who doesn't know what the People's Climate March was, it was a march that happened in New York City on September 21st. Yeah? And it was during the UN Climate Week. So Ban Ki-moon was convening world leaders to talk about climate change because hopefully in 2015, the world leaders are going to set global carbon emission standards. And it was the prep for that to make sure that that actually happens. And 350.org and several other organizations came together and said, you know, it would be great to show our world leaders that we are actually for climate change so that they know that we're serious. But this should be the largest climate march in the world, because when the world leaders were in Copenhagen, 100,000 people came out and marched in the streets. I think that we can do better. And we can have marches that happen all over the world. So for a year, all these different groups got together and planned what was hopefully going to be the largest climate march in history, and wildly exceeded expectations. There were 310,000 people there instead of 100,000 people. And I took my parents, I took my husband, and my day at the climate march was incredible. They paid real specific attention to who was at the front of the march to make sure that people saw who's most at risk if we go sideways on this climate change thing. And it's people of color, it's indigenous communities. So people of color and indigenous communities were at the front of the march. We were marching in a contingent that was right behind the Aztec dancers. And I'll tell you what, this was not a short march. Maybe it was, and it just felt like a really long march, but in New York City, they don't have a concept of like what's long and short. I'm from LA, we don't walk. So for me, it was a very long march. And these Aztec dancers were holding a spiritual line the whole time. They were smudging in a circle. They were singing. They were dancing. They were praying. They had their babies there. They had their elders there. They held a wall around them to make sure that the dancers were protected as they were dancing. And it was powerful. It shut people up who walked by. They really felt the energy, and they felt the urgency of this. And so many communities did displays like that in the march. And when I talk about 310,000 people and the level of diversity that was there, that's what we need for our movement. We need that number of people, 3 times the amount of people we think we need to create change. That's about right. That's what we need. We need to figure out what everyone actually needs to feel and to interact with in order to get activated and inspired to create change. And then we need concrete plans for how to make that change. Luckily, there are hundreds of organizations across this country who are working on those concrete plans. And they're really doing it. They're really doing it. There was a research group I recently talked to of people that are getting together who are trying to figure out how every coal miner in America can get a job in solar and wind. What a transition plan actually looks like if you do it concretely. There are people who work every day to make sure that the most vulnerable Americans get access to meaningful employment and have a way to do that. Raquel is here in the audience. Raise your hand, Raquel. She does incredible work in that arena. And then there's you, who cared enough to come to this presentation, who cared enough to come to this conference. Find your place. And let's get to work. Thank you. So I am open to taking any questions you have. Yes.
I do not work in the food arena, for lack of a better way to say it. I'm curious about the many parts of the world, from a layperson's perspective, where the food baskets, the farm concentration, seems to me are in arid areas. Do we need to rethink that on a very dramatic scale?
So, I was supposed to do the reminder. There is a microphone for questions. It's right there. So I will repeat that question. The question was, in the American, not in the American, all over the world, there are central locations of farming that are in very arid areas. And do we need to rethink that? So when it comes to the way that we produce food in the world, we need to rethink all of it. Like the whole thing. Like everything about the way that we produce and consume food. So much of the way that we produce and consume food is political, right? And I don't know as much as I could, I'll say that, about the global food system in terms of where food is produced, but I do know quite a bit about the American food system and where food is produced and how it's produced. And if common sense was an issue, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in right now. We know monocropping kills soil, uses way too much water, and is very hard to maintain, and yet we do it. We know pesticides kill people, and yet we use them. So, I mean, it's just, for me, this is why we need a movement. And that's why my talk is about movement building. Because in Europe, when they heard that they were going to start having GMOs in their food, they burnt fields to the ground. They said, oh, you're going to start feeding us things we don't know what they are? Burn you up. We're actually not going to have that. But in America, we don't burn things down. So I think that civil disobedience, it's time for it. I mean, we're in dire enough circumstances to where civil disobedience is actually called for. And yet we don't really, it hasn't clicked yet that nothing's going to happen unless we make it happen. So if we want to confront political issues that make no common sense, we're going to have to get a little bit rowdier. Any other questions for the microphone? Yeah. And I'll repeat your question. So the question was, I spoke a little bit about the collaborative economy and the power that it has during times of climate disaster. The question is, how do we get more people of color into the collaborative economy? So a little bit more about the collaborative economy. The sharing economy, collaborative economy, peer-to-peer networks, et cetera, is something that's used to describe Uber, Airbnb, Lyft, different peer-to-peer technology platforms that allow people to give and exchange resources, right? And make money based on the assets that they have themselves, instead of outsourcing it and paying a hotel or a cab service for it. With me so far? So there have been some studies that have been done to look at the racial profile of people who are using the collaborative economy. And not surprisingly, it follows the racial profile of what happens in America. People who look the same tend to seek people who look the same on Airbnb. Airbnb is one of the digital discrimination Airbnb was one of the first reports that was done about this. And it found that African Americans have a lower acceptance rate than white people inside of Airbnb. And there's a ton of anecdotal stories about this, but I tend to like the facts and the data. Uber also recently came under fire for this because there were a lot of people that were losing work because the driver's pictures come up, but the passengers' pictures don't in Uber, but they do in Lyft. So people were canceling rides if they got drivers of color or just drivers from a background they didn't like. And then they would pop up on the screen again because they were trying to find another driver and get another driver to accept. So there were all these cancellations, and they couldn't figure out why the algorithm was so screwed. And it was because people were afraid to ride with Arabs, African Americans, et cetera, right? So the collaborative economy, to me, all that means is that, gee, we still have some race issues in America. I don't think anyone was confused about well, maybe there are some people that. So for anyone who is confused, we still have race issues in America. 1 in 3 African American men will still end up in prison in their lifetime. The United States still has, I think, 25% of the world's prisoners, but 5% of its population, et cetera, and so on, and the majority of them are people of color. Yes, right? This is how we are, and this is how we do. And if you create a peer-to-peer network, the assumption that peer-to-peer network are neutral is like the assumption that America is neutral. No. Actually, no. So how do you create a peer-to-peer network that sits on top of a history of genocide and slavery that's never been dealt with? That's really the question that I have about the collaborative economy. I don't think that it's impossible. I think that in peer-to-peer networks, you actually have an opportunity to talk person to person about things that may be very difficult for corporations to talk about. Airbnb has this, they have a global community network of hosts that get together and talk about different topics together. And race has come up as one thing that groups of hosts are getting together to try to discuss and talk about. So when it comes to how to get more people of color into the collaborative economy, I think it's necessary, because the collaborative economy, gig economy, etc., when you're in survival mode and you need to get diapers right now, you could be a TaskRabbit, you could be an Uber driver, you could get money right now and earn it. I think that that's wonderful. We just have to figure out how everyone who wants to have access to that can get access to that in a way that's meaningful. Yes. Yes. So I'm trying to figure out how to repeat that. So when we're talking about the collaborative economy and peer-to-peer networks, when we talk about climate change and climate disaster, one of the benefits or the opportunities, and if I get this wrong, Raquel, let me know, but one of the benefits or the opportunities with the collaborative economy is getting resources from people who have them to the people who need them, but also making sure that there's a layer of trust in there. How do people feel comfortable getting resources? How do people feel comfortable giving resources? And creating peer-to-peer networks that can actually deal with communities where they are and actually create opportunities within communities instead of outsourcing the opportunities so that wealth is extracted from communities. Yeah? Okay. 1 and 2. And if anyone wants to, I feel their gaze over there. So if anyone wants to use the mic, feel absolutely free. I just got permission to let go of the mic. Okay. Mm-hmm. The question is looking at the types of new collaborations that are happening and wanting to hear a little bit more of my personal experience in movement building and what types of collaborations are possible or could come. So I'll share a bit. What's effective? Okay. So for me, when thinking about collaboration, what's effective is do not reinvent the wheel, right? This question of collaborative economy, for example, how do you get people of color into the collaborative economy? The question that, taking a step back question that occurs to me is, do people of color share? Yeah. Have we always shared to make ends meet? Yes. Did we develop institutions to share so that we could make ends meet? Why, yes. Are there philosophies around sharing with thy neighbor, perhaps? Yes. So when looking at the collaborative economy, we didn't try to create a sharing platform that was located on Android phones because African Americans statistically use Androids more than iPhones, and tried to create something that we thought black folks could share. Instead, we went to a network that fosters collaboration and sharing inside of African American communities already. They just don't call themselves the collaborative economy. We went to churches. So for me, in terms of what's effective, you go where the gold is. And you don't assume that you know everything, right? I grew up in black churches, so I know that part of the sharing part of black churches. I could go get a backpack. I could go get some shoes. I could go get some clothes. I could swap anything at my church after church on Sunday. Absolutely anything. We go down for coffee hour after church. It is a swap meet. My people, swap meet is the other definition of grocery store, a department store, etc. Swap meeting. It's what we do. That is the collaborative economy, just without a cutesy little happy smiley face on a smartphone that says now you can make money off of it, right? So I also feel like I want to lift up the People's Climate March as another example of collaboration, because if you want to talk about how to do it right, I thought that it was going to be impossible to pull off what they were able to pull off. But 350 from the very beginning decided to be a backbone organization. They worked very heavily with New York City local environmental justice organizations for months. And they literally held national organizations back. I think that when it comes to like the 1-2 step, this one's also very important in terms of what's effective. Those who have more resources, more access, and more privilege are always going to want to jump in the party hella early because they can, because they have capacity. It usually takes folks that don't have a lot of capacity a little longer to start things, to get it together, to collaborate, etc. Because when we're on the ground, we move at a different pace. It's relationship driven. Calm the hell down. Drink something. We'll be with you in a second, right? Or at least that's how I was when I was at People's Grocery. We got people to feed. We got things to do. We may not move very quickly. 350.org and other backbone organizations made sure that they worked with those New York local organizations for long enough so that they could actually host everyone else who came in. So the power relationship was different. So that's the last thing I'll say, is when it comes to power, for me, collaboration it's a power relationship. And those who have had the most taken from them, for me, should have the first thing to say. And whatever it takes to create that situation is what should be done when you're looking at collaboration. And it's just hard to do that sometimes, and it takes convincing sometimes, especially from the people who are paying for it, but it's worth it. Then you had a question. Ooh, civil disobedience and what it looks like when it's effective. Well, I mean, the history of environmental justice is civil disobedience, right? That's how the field started. I have not participated in civil disobedience for a very long time because I've been masquerading as an executive director who can't chain herself to things because I have to raise money. But I know that when I so I'll talk about when I participated in it before and the history of civil disobedience and environmental justice. So in environmental justice, it was people laying down in the street. It was people not allowing bulldozers to pass. It was people chaining themselves to things. It was people using their bodies as shields that allowed the field of environmental justice to start, because it was life or death. And usually it takes things getting to life or death in order for people to change. When I did civil disobedience, it was mostly around the Iraq War, and it was mostly in Los Angeles. And we shut that city down. Now, it didn't change anything, which was really unfortunate. But when you're talking about that level, when you're going to war and you're doing civil disobedience, what you can change, and this I think is also coming from a very personal place, what you can change are the lives of the soldiers. My baby brother is in the Navy, and he has been to Afghanistan. He went for 8 months last year. And the suicide rate and the state of what is happening to our veterans is awful. It is awful. The average age of a soldier is 20 and a half. So these are children. They're babies who are going to war. And if civil disobedience can't change our wars, what it can do is get a whole group of Americans activated around the fact that we have to protect those who are most vulnerable. And lots of times it is the most vulnerable Americans who sign up to become soldiers because of the advantages it gives them. So I think what it's going to take to actually do civil disobedience in our movement It's things like the Yes Men. So if you're not familiar with the Yes Men, Mike and Andy are the Yes Men, and they started by masquerading as higher ups and CEOs and officers of these horrifying corporations and saying things that were just crazy and getting kicked out of places. So one of their more famous ones was when Andy dressed up as someone from Dow, I believe it was, who had just absorbed, what was it? I remember that it was the 20th anniversary of Bhopal, and Dow had just absorbed the company that caused all that. And he got on BBC to like 300 million people as a representative of Dow and said that they were dissolving that corporation and we're going to use that like $12 billion or whatever to pay for all the damages that had happened in Bhopal. And now when you talk about civil disobedience, this is a very sophisticated type of civil disobedience that opens you up to lawsuits. I mean, you're not just talking about getting arrested for chaining yourself to something. You are this fraud, like it's just a bunch of different stuff. And Mike and Andy have been able to do this many, many times. And now they have something called the Yes Lab in New York City, where if you want to do things like that are more satire, that are more political, that take a lot of planning and they're really sophisticated, you can go to the Yes Lab and they will help you put it together and help you figure out how to not like lose your whole life because of it. So I highly recommend finding things like that when it comes to ways of civil disobedience that could actually speak to us. And I probably have time for like one or two more questions. Yeah. Yeah. This is one of my favorite topics. I often think that one of the reasons why we don't have civil disobedience now is because we don't have a soundtrack. Because most movements have a soundtrack, and they are not optional. They are usually how things start. So, little known fact, I'll start with personal and then get to the little known fact. So personally, I'm the great-grandchild of one of the first black men that did blackface minstrelsy in the South, Alan Jones and his 7 brown babies. And that's what he did. And he raised my grandfather, Carl Jones, who was a part of the Delta Rhythm Boys, which is a blues quartet, and I believe they hold a world record for like most soundtracks collaborated on or something. And he spoke 9 languages. He sung in all of those languages. The Delta Rhythm Boys performed from the 30s all the way to the 70s. They were pretty epic. And being raised in that kind of musical family when you're African American is profound, because when we couldn't cry, we could entertain. And when we couldn't vote, we could entertain. And when we couldn't learn to read, we could sing. Singing and entertaining was our ability to express ourselves when we couldn't do anything to express ourselves. Our drums were taken away from us. Our dance was taken away from us. But we could sing. And so being raised in that tradition was powerful for me. And in addition to that, my grandfather was a rabble-rouser. One of his favorite stories was that he collaborated on the soundtrack of Gone with the Wind. So he and his best friend were on the Gone with the Wind site wandering around, and they saw the porta potties were segregated, colored only, white only. So being the troublemakers that they were, they wandered around until they found Clark Gable's trailer. And they cornered him in his trailer and gave him this whole, they gave him a speech, but only after I think they got him drunk. They did something. It was crazy. But like they sat him down and basically got him all riled up about the fact that the porta potties were segregated and about the plight of the black man in America. So Clark Gable went to the director and said, "I will walk off this set unless you desegregate the porta potties." So my grandfather got the porta potties on the Gone with the Wind set desegregated. And that was the kind of dude he was. So you have that kind of troublemaker who's in a blues quartet, and the mixture of what it takes to actually create change is there. So I was activated around this from the time I was very young. And now to the little known fact. Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday was released in the 1930s, and it was the very first song or knowing in mainstream popular culture that lynching was a thing. Everybody kind of knew that it existed, but people didn't know, they didn't feel it. It wasn't a gut reaction for them. And you certainly did not discuss it in polite company. But Billie Holiday was someone who was polite company for people. So she was able to sing about strange fruit in the 30s. And there's this wonderful book called Strange Fruit that describes how the release of that song led to the civil rights movement, and can just go the blow by blow and show how the activation of a song about something that couldn't be spoken about allowed black people to be able to vote eventually. So for me, the role of music and the role of song is to be able to confront things that can't be confronted directly. Sometimes you have to go around the side, or sometimes you have to go under, sometimes you have to go over to get there. And that's actually a good way to close. For those of you who have not heard Strange Fruit, I will sing it for you, because I moonlight as a singer. So before I sing, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you all, you live stream folk. Appreciate you. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, black bodies swinging from the poplar trees. Thank you.